The distant crack of a rifle shot echoed across the valley as Caleb Steele pressed his body flat against the dusty earth, blood seeping through his worn cotton shirt. It wasn't the first time he'd been shot, but this wound felt different, deeper somehow, both in flesh and spirit. 1878 had been a merciless year for him. An autumn in New Mexico territory seemed determined to claim what little remained of his soul before winter arrived. Caleb dragged himself toward his horse, a sturdy palomino that had seen as many harsh days as its master. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain radiating from his shoulder, but he'd survived worse. After hauling himself into the saddle with a grunt, he pointed the horse toward the only place that might offer refuge, truth or consequences, a small settlement nestled between the mountains and desert. The town had earned its peculiar name from a dispute between two founding families that had ended in a public showdown and unexpected reconciliation. Local legend claimed that anyone who came to truth or consequences would eventually face both their deepest truth and its consequences. Caleb had avoided both for years, his vision blurred as he approached the town's limits. The last thing he remembered was sliding from his saddle outside Doc Miller's place, the world tilting sideways before darkness swallowed him whole. When Caleb opened his eyes again, sunlight was streaming through unfamiliar curtains. He tried to sit up but found himself restrained by a firm yet gentle hand. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," came a woman's voice, clear as a mountain stream. "You've lost enough blood to fill a washtub." Caleb's eyes struggled to focus on the figure beside him. She was dressed simply in a blue calico dress, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun, though several rebellious strands had escaped to frame her face. "Who are you?" he managed to rasp, his throat parched. "Ruby Norton. I help Doc Miller when things get busy." She offered him water, supporting his head as he drank. "And you're Caleb Steele, according to the papers in your saddlebag. The doctor had to check them to see if you had family that should be notified." Caleb turned his face away. "No family." "Well, Mr. Steele, you've been shot rather impressively. The bullet missed anything vital, but infection had set in. You've been fighting fever for 3 days. 3 days." Caleb closed his eyes, calculating. Whoever had shot him, likely one of the Jensen gang he'd crossed paths with near Silver City, would assume he was dead by now. That was something, at least. Doc Miller had to leave for Santa Fe yesterday, his sister's taken ill. "I'll be looking after you until he returns," Ruby continued, changing the bandage on his shoulder with practiced efficiency. Caleb remained silent, observing her through narrowed eyes. He'd learned long ago that words were dangerous things, best used sparingly. Most people filled silence with chatter, revealing more than they intended. But Ruby Norton seemed comfortable with quiet, humming softly to herself as she worked. "There," she said finally. "Try to rest. I'll bring some broth later." Over the next week, Ruby became a constant presence. She changed his bandages, brought him meals, and read aloud from a dog-eared copy of The Last of the Mohicans when the silence grew too heavy. Caleb rarely responded beyond necessary answers, but he found himself listening for her footsteps on the wooden floor, anticipating the musical quality of her voice. On the 8th day, Caleb was sitting up in bed when Ruby entered with a tray of food and a newspaper tucked under her arm. "You're looking better today," she observed, placing the tray beside him. "Doc sent word he'll be back tomorrow." Caleb nodded, taking the bowl of stew she offered. "I should be moving on then." Ruby laughed, a sound so unexpected and bright that Caleb nearly dropped his spoon. "You can barely stand for 2 minutes without going pale as a ghost, Mr. Steele. I doubt you'll be moving on any time soon." There was something about her laughter that caught him off guard. It wasn't mocking or false, it was genuine, warm like sunshine after a long winter. For reasons he couldn't explain, Caleb found himself wanting to hear it again. "I've been in worse shape," he muttered. "I don't doubt it," Ruby replied, studying the numerous scars visible on his chest and arms. "You've lived a hard life, Mr. Steele." "Just Caleb," he said, surprising himself. Ruby smiled. "Caleb, then." She unfolded the newspaper. "Would you like me to read the news? There's been some excitement with the railroad expansion." Caleb shrugged, which Ruby correctly interpreted as agreement. As she read, Caleb found himself watching her face, the way her eyes lit up when something interested her, how her lips curved around certain words. It had been a long time since he'd really looked at another person without assessing them as a potential threat. By the time Doc Miller returned, Caleb had progressed to walking short distances around the room. The doctor examined him thoroughly before pronouncing him on the mend. "You were lucky, Mr. Steele. An inch to the left and we wouldn't be having this conversation." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Caleb responded. "Good aim, maybe." Doc Miller raised an eyebrow. "Well, whatever you call it, you need another week of rest before traveling. I've arranged for you to stay at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. Ruby will help you move there this afternoon." Caleb wanted to protest, but he knew the doctor was right. He wasn't ready to ride out yet. Besides, he needed to make plans. The Jensens would be looking for him once they realized he wasn't dead. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house sat on the edge of town, a two-story wooden structure with a wide front porch. The landlady was a plump, no-nonsense woman who showed Caleb to a small but clean room on the ground floor. "Meals are at 7, noon, and 6, she informed him. "No liquor, no gambling, and no women in the rooms. Rent's due weekly in advance." Caleb nodded, placing the few coins he had on the dresser. Mrs. Henderson counted them, frowned slightly, but pocketed the money. "Miss Norton says you're recovering from a hunting accident," she said, her tone making it clear she didn't believe this story for a moment. "I don't care what kind of trouble you're in, Mr. Steele, as long as you don't bring it into my house." After she left, Caleb sat heavily on the narrow bed. His funds were dangerously low, barely enough for another week's lodging. He needed work, but in his current condition, the usual jobs available to him were impossible. A light knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Ruby stood there holding a small bundle. "I brought some of my brother's old clothes," she explained. "He was about your size before he moved to California." Caleb accepted the bundle, awkward with gratitude. "Thank you. I'll return them when I can get my own." Ruby leaned against the doorframe. "What will you do now?" The question caught him off guard. Nobody had asked about his plans in years, mainly because he rarely had any beyond survival. "Find work, I suppose," he said finally. "Once I can use my arm properly." Ruby nodded thoughtfully. "My father owns the livery stable. He's been looking for someone who knows horses. It wouldn't be strenuous work at first, just helping with feeding and grooming until you're stronger." Caleb studied her face, looking for the angle, the hidden motive. People didn't offer help without expecting something in return. But Ruby's expression remained open, expectant. "Why would you do that?" he asked bluntly. Ruby's smile faded slightly. "Because you need work and my father needs help. It's not charity, Mr. Steele. It's an exchange of services." Caleb considered this. A livery stable would be a good place to keep an eye on who came into town. He could rebuild his strength while earning enough to move on when the time was right. "I'll talk to your father tomorrow," he decided. Ruby's smile returned. "Good. I'll let him know to expect you." The next morning, Caleb made his way to the livery stable at the edge of town. The building was well maintained, with a large corral attached to one side. A broad-shouldered man with graying auburn hair was shoeing a bay mare when Caleb approached. "Mr. Norton," Caleb called. The man looked up, his weathered face impassive. "That's me. You must be Steele." They sized each other up, two men accustomed to measuring others against potential danger. Finally, Norton nodded, seemingly satisfied with what he saw. "Ruby says you know horses," he said. "I do," Caleb confirmed. "Show me." For the next hour, Norton watched as Caleb demonstrated his knowledge, handling even the most temperamental horses with quiet confidence. Despite the pain in his shoulder, Caleb didn't falter. Finally, Norton grunted his approval. "You'll do." "Pays fair room and board plus $2 a day. You can have the room above the stable if you'd rather not stay at Henderson's." The offer of lodging was unexpected but welcome. "I'll take it," Caleb agreed. Over the following weeks, Caleb settled into a routine at the livery. The work was physically demanding but straightforward, and Norton proved to be a fair employer who respected competence and didn't waste time with unnecessary conversation. The small room above the stable became Caleb's first real home in years, sparse but private, with a small stove for cooking and a view of the mountains beyond the town. Ruby visited the stable often, bringing meals or simply stopping by on her way to other errands. At first, Caleb maintained his guarded silence, responding only when necessary. But gradually, something about her presence began to wear away at his defenses. It was her laughter that did it, the way it rang out unrestrained when something amused her, how it seemed to warm the very air around them. Caleb found himself doing things just to hear that sound, making dry observations about the townspeople, or sharing rare anecdotes from his travels that weren't steeped in blood and regret. One afternoon, as Caleb was exercising a client's spirited black gelding in the corral, Ruby arrived with a basket of fresh bread. "That horse looks like he wants to be anywhere but here," she observed, leaning against the fence. Caleb nodded, guiding the horse through another circuit. "He's town shy. Needs to learn that buildings won't eat him." "Like some people I know," Ruby remarked with a pointed look at Caleb. The comparison startled a short laugh from him, a rusty sound he barely recognized as his own. Ruby's eyes widened in delighted surprise. "So you can laugh," she said, grinning. "I was beginning to wonder." Caleb brought the horse to a stop, suddenly uncomfortable with her observation. "Haven't had much reason to," Ruby's expression softened. "Everyone has reason to laugh, Caleb. Sometimes you just have to look harder for it." That evening, as Caleb sat on the small porch outside his room watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, he found himself thinking about Ruby's words. When had he last found joy in simple things? Before the war, perhaps. Before he'd buried his family and taken to the trail with vengeance burning in his heart. The sound of footsteps on the ladder drew his attention. Ruby appeared, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "Pa's closing up," she explained, offering him one of the mugs. "Thought you might like some company." Caleb accepted both the coffee and her company, moving slightly to make room on the narrow bench. They sat in companionable silence, watching as the stars began to appear in the deepening blue of the sky. "You're a mystery, Caleb Steele," Ruby said finally. "You came here half dead with nothing but the clothes on your back and trouble on your trail, yet you work harder than men with everything to live for." Caleb stared into his coffee. "Maybe I'm just earning my keep." "Maybe," Ruby agreed. "Or maybe you're running from something you can't outrun." Caleb's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you have nightmares," she said quietly. "I've heard you call out when I've come early to the stable. I know you check every exit wherever you go. I know you never fully turn your back to a door or window." Anger flared briefly in Caleb's chest, then subsided into a dull resignation. "Observant. I like puzzles," Ruby admitted. "And you, Caleb Steele, are the most complicated puzzle I've ever encountered. Despite himself, Caleb felt the corner of his mouth quirk upward. Not much to solve. I've made enemies. They're still out there. And that's why you keep moving. Why you don't let anyone get close. Caleb didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. Ruby set her empty mug aside. What if I told you that running isn't always the answer? That some things are worth standing your ground for? I'd say you've led a fortunate life if you believe that, Caleb replied. Ruby laughed, but it wasn't her usual bright sound. It held a sharper edge. You think you have a monopoly on suffering, Cowboy? My mother died when I was 12. My brother left for California after a man he trusted cheated him out of his mining claim. I've nursed gunshot victims and buried children who didn't survive diphtheria. She stood, facing him directly. Life is hard everywhere, Caleb. The difference is whether you face it alone or with people who care about you. Before Caleb could respond, she descended the ladder, leaving him alone with thoughts more turbulent than they'd been in years. The following Sunday, to his own surprise, Caleb found himself walking toward the small white church at the center of town. He hadn't stepped foot in a church since before the war, but something about Ruby's words had unsettled him, creating a restlessness he couldn't shake. He slipped into the back pew just as the service began, his presence drawing curious glances from the townspeople. Ruby sat near the front with her father, but she turned as if sensing him, her eyes widening slightly before she offered a small, encouraging smile. After the service, Caleb lingered awkwardly outside, not entirely sure why he had come or what he was waiting for. People nodded politely as they passed, some even offering greetings. He was no longer a complete stranger to them. Over the past weeks, he had shod their horses, repaired their wagons, and even helped search for a child who had wandered away from her parents, found safely asleep under a shopkeeper's porch, thankfully. Never expected to see you here, Norton commented, approaching with Ruby beside him. Caleb shrugged. Seemed like a good day for it. We're having dinner at home, Ruby said. Would you like to join us? The invitation should have triggered Caleb's instinct to retreat, to maintain the careful distance he kept from others. Instead, he heard himself accepting. The Norton home was modest, but welcoming, a small house behind the livery stable with a kitchen garden and a covered porch. Inside, the furnishings were simple but well cared for, with touches that spoke of a woman's influence despite the absence of a mother. As Ruby prepared the meal, Caleb and her father discussed business, the horses boarded at the livery, plans for expanding the corral, the rising cost of feed. It was ordinary conversation, the kind Caleb had avoided for years, yet he found himself engaged, offering suggestions based on practices he'd seen in other territories. During dinner, Ruby shared news of the town, the mayor's wife expecting their 5th child, the schoolteacher's upcoming wedding, the dispute between the general store owner and the new merchant who had opened shop across the street. Thompson claims Reynolds is undercutting his prices deliberately, Ruby explained, passing Caleb a plate of biscuits. Reynolds says he's just being competitive. Sounds like they both need to worry less about each other and more about serving their customers, Caleb remarked. Ruby laughed, that bright, infectious sound that seemed to light something within Caleb's chest. That's exactly what I told them. You should have seen their faces. After dinner, Norton excused himself to check on a mare that was close to foaling, leaving Caleb and Ruby to clean up. Thank you for coming today, Ruby said as they washed dishes side by side. It meant a lot to Pa. He doesn't say it, but he's grown fond of you. Caleb concentrated on drying a plate. He's a good man. You both are good people. Ruby turned to face him, her hands still dripping with dishwater. Is it so hard to believe that we might care about you, Caleb? The directness of her question left him momentarily speechless. For years, he had existed on the periphery of other people's lives, moving on before connections could form, before caring became a liability. Yes, he admitted finally. It is. Ruby reached out, touching his scarred forearm gently. Then perhaps that's the real tragedy, not whatever you're running from, but what you've denied yourself while running. Her words stayed with him long after he returned to his room above the stable, echoing in his mind as he stared at the ceiling. What had he denied himself? Safety, certainly. Friendship. The comfort of belonging somewhere. And something else, something he hadn't allowed himself to name until now. The next morning brought unexpected visitors to truth or consequences. Caleb was exercising horses in the corral when he spotted 3 riders entering town, rough-looking men with the hard eyes of those who lived outside the law. Even from a distance, he recognized one of them. Ben Jensen, the youngest brother of the gang he'd crossed months ago. Caleb led the horse back to the stable, his mind racing. If the Jensens were here, it meant they'd somehow tracked him. Perhaps someone from his past had passed through and recognized him, or maybe it was just bad luck. Either way, he needed to leave immediately. He was saddling his own horse when Norton entered the stable, going somewhere. The older man asked, taking in the packed saddlebags and Caleb's grim expression. "Need to move on," Caleb replied tersely. Norton crossed his arms. "Those men who rode in, they looking for you?" Caleb paused. "Yes." "What did you do?" Caleb tightened the cinch, avoiding Norton's gaze. "Their brother tried to rob a stagecoach I was guarding. He didn't survive the attempt." Norton was silent for a long moment. "Self-defense, then?" He drew first. Norton nodded slowly. "And now you're running again." "It's what I do," Caleb said flatly. "Is it what you want to do?" The question brought Caleb up short. One had never entered into the equation. Survival was all that mattered. But now, with his hand on the saddle and escape within reach, he found himself hesitating. Images flashed through his mind. Ruby laughing as she tossed feed to the chickens behind her house. The quiet satisfaction of working alongside Norton. The tentative greetings from townspeople who had begun to accept him as one of their own. "What I want doesn't matter," he said finally. "They'll tear this place apart looking for me. People could get hurt." Norton's weathered face hardened with determination. "This town has faced down Apache raids, drought, and outlaws before you came, Steele. We can handle 3 men with a grudge." Before Caleb could respond, the stable door opened again and Ruby rushed in, her face flushed. "There you are," she said, relief evident in her voice. "Those men at the saloon, they're asking about a man matching your description." Caleb swore under his breath. "See, they're already looking." "I need to go." Ruby's eyes flashed with unexpected anger. "So that's it, you're just leaving after everything?" "It's for your protection," Caleb insisted. "These men don't care who gets hurt." "And you think running protects us?" Ruby demanded. "They've already found you here, Caleb. What if they decide to make an example of the town that harbored you, even after you're gone?" The possibility hadn't occurred to Caleb, and it stopped him cold. The Jensens were vindictive enough to do exactly that, especially if they thought the townspeople were helping him escape. Norton placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Ruby's right. Running won't solve this, but we have something they don't." "What's that?" Caleb asked. "A community that stands together," Norton replied simply. "Let me talk to Sheriff Davis. This isn't just your fight anymore, Steele." For the first time in years, Caleb found himself confronted with a choice that wasn't simply between flight and confrontation, but between continuing his solitary existence and accepting that he had found something worth defending. He looked at Ruby, whose expression had softened from anger to concern. "I don't want you involved in this." "I've been involved since I decided not to let you bleed to death on Doc Miller's floor," she countered. "Some choices aren't just yours to make anymore." The realization struck Caleb with unexpected force. Somewhere along the way, his life had become intertwined with others. The careful isolation he had maintained for so long had been breached, not by violence or pursuit, but by a woman's laughter and a community's quiet acceptance. "I need to think," he said finally, stepping away from his horse. Ruby nodded. "Think then, but remember running only works if there's nothing worth staying for." She left, and Norton followed after a long, measuring look at Caleb. Alone in the stable, Caleb paced, weighing options that had never seemed available before. The smart choice, the survivor's choice, was to ride out, draw the Jensens away from town. But for the first time in years, he questioned whether survival alone was enough. As twilight approached, Caleb made his decision. He found Sheriff Davis at his office, Norton already there. The lawman was older than Caleb expected, with a limp from an old wound, but his eyes were sharp and assessing. "Mr. Steele," Davis greeted him. "Norton here says you might have information about our visitors." Caleb nodded, then proceeded to tell the sheriff everything his past as a stage coach guard, the attempted robbery, the Jensen gang's reputation for brutal reprisals. Davis listened without interruption, making occasional notes. "The oldest brother, Frank Jensen, is the real danger," Caleb concluded. "He doesn't forget or forgive. If he's not with them now, he will be soon." Davis leaned back in his chair. "Seems to me you've got two choices, Steele. You can run, might work, might not, or you can stand with us and end this." "I won't risk the town," Caleb insisted. "Town's already at risk," Norton pointed out. "Question is whether you're going to help us face it or leave us to handle it without knowing what we're up against." Put that way, Caleb's choice became clear. What did you have in mind? The plan they developed was simple but effective. Word spread quietly through town. Doors were locked, shutters closed, women and children gathered in the church basement. By nightfall, Truth or Consequences appeared nearly deserted, with only the saloon showing signs of life. Inside, Caleb sat at a back table with Norton and Davis, a glass of untouched whiskey before him. Several townsmen were positioned strategically around the room, their presence casual but their purpose understood. They didn't have to wait long. The three Jensen men entered just after 9, their spurs jangling against the wooden floor as they approached the bar. Ben, the youngest, ordered drinks for all of them, his eyes scanning the room. When his gaze landed on Caleb, a slow, malicious smile spread across his face. "Well, look what we found, boys," he drawled. "The man who killed our brother." The saloon went silent as the other patrons tensed. Caleb remained seated, his expression neutral. "Your brother drew on me first, Jensen," he said evenly. "He made his choice." "And now you'll pay for it," Ben snarled, his hand dropping to his holster. "I wouldn't," Sheriff Davis advised, rising to his feet. "This man is under my protection, and so is this town." The oldest of the three, not Frank, but clearly in charge of this group, assessed the situation with calculating eyes. "We ain't looking for trouble with the law, Sheriff. Just justice for our kin." "Justice happens in a courtroom," Davis replied, "not at the end of a gun." The standoff stretched, tension thick in the air. Caleb knew the Jensens were counting heads, measuring their odds. 3 against a roomful of armed townsmen weren't good odds, even for experienced outlaws. "Frank won't be happy about this," Ben muttered to his companions. He wanted to handle Steele personally. "Frank isn't here," Caleb said, standing slowly, "and he won't be coming. Federal marshals picked him up near Fort Sumner last month. Didn't you know?" The uncertainty that flashed across their faces told Caleb his bluff had hit home. Without Frank's leadership, the remaining Jensens were less formidable, still dangerous, but less committed to a cause that might get them killed. "You're lying," Ben accused, but his voice lacked conviction. Sheriff Davis stepped forward. "I received the wire myself. Frank Jensen will hang in Santa Fe next month." It was a masterful lie, delivered with perfect conviction. Caleb watched as doubt crept into the brothers' expressions, followed by the first signs of fear. "You have a choice," Caleb told them. "Ride out now. Forget you ever heard my name and you might live to see next year. Or draw and end up buried beside your brother." For a tense moment, it could have gone either way. Then the oldest brother made a subtle gesture and all three eased their hands away from their weapons. "This isn't over, Steele," he warned. "Yes," Caleb countered. "It is." Sheriff Davis and his deputy escorted the Jensens to the town limits, making it clear they wouldn't be welcome should they return. Caleb watched them ride away, aware that a weight he had carried for years seemed lighter somehow. Norton clapped him on the shoulder. "Good bluff about Frank Jensen." Caleb shook his head. "It wasn't entirely a bluff. Last I heard, marshals were closing in on him near Fort Sumner. Whether they got him or not, I don't know." "Either way," Norton said, "I doubt they'll be back, not with the reception they got." As the townspeople emerged from their homes and the church, a sense of collective relief spread through Truth or Consequences. Several men approached Caleb, offering handshakes and words of support. It was an unfamiliar sensation being part of something larger than himself, being accepted despite his past. Caleb found Ruby waiting outside the saloon, her face pale with concern. When she saw him unharmed, she rushed forward, surprising them both by throwing her arms around him. "They're gone?" she asked against his shoulder. Caleb nodded, tentatively returning her embrace. "They're gone." She pulled back slightly, studying his face. "And you? Are you still planning to leave?" It was the question Caleb had been asking himself since the Jensens had ridden away. The instinct to move on, to avoid putting down roots that could be violently torn up, was still there but weaker now, overshadowed by newer, stronger feelings. "I think," he said slowly, "that I might stay, if there's a reason to." Ruby's smile blossomed, illuminating her face in the lamplight. "I can think of several reasons," she said, and then she laughed, that bright, beautiful sound that had first begun to heal the scarred places inside him. Caleb felt something shift within him, a wall crumbling, a door opening to possibilities he had denied himself for too long. Without overthinking, he leaned down and kissed her, his calloused hand gently cradling her cheek. When they parted, Ruby's eyes were shining. "Took you long enough, Cowboy." Caleb smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes, perhaps the first in years. "I'm a slow learner." "That's all right," Ruby assured him, linking her arm through his. "We have time." As they walked together through the quiet streets of Truth or Consequences, Caleb realized she was right. For the first time since the war, since the losses that had hardened him into a man of silence and sharp edges, he had found someone worth staying for. Ruby's laughter had done what no amount of time or distance could accomplish. It had begun to heal the scars he had hidden for so long. The consequences of staying would unfold in time, a livery stable that grew into the finest in the territory, a small house built with his own hands, children with their mother's laugh and their father's quiet determination. Challenges would come: droughts, harsh winters, the occasional trouble that found its way to even the most peaceful towns, but they would face them together. For now, though, it was enough to walk beside her under the vast New Mexico sky, feeling the hard edges of his soul being slowly, surely, smoothed away by the promise of tomorrow and the sound of Ruby Norton's laughter.